At GBPI, we track how the state raises and spends its money. More specifically, about 83 cents of every dollar is tracked by this team at GBPI. However, we've also begun to stretch our work to DC, and with a change in administration that could threaten vital healthcare and food security funds to the state, we are also stretching locally, looking at municipalities and their reliance on fines and fees, or monitoring the impact of decision-making around municipal level opt-in for the property tax cap approved on the November general ballot. Y'all, it's gonna be a busy year. And last, I heard some amen on that. Last week, Governor Kemp gave his State of the State address on Thursday, where he discussed a few things, including a proposed tax reduction and his thoughts on health coverage. When it comes to tax reduction, reducing Georgia's flat income tax rate from 5.39% to 5.19% would cost an estimated $748 million per year. Middle income families, those are earning about $61,000 as a household, would only save about $70 a year with this tax cut. The largest tax cuts, as we well know in Georgia, benefit those earning the highest incomes, making the state's tax code more regressive. Georgia could prioritize the middle and lower income families by creating a state refundable, and you'll hear more about that, refundable tax credit along with the measures targeted to help Georgians afford to meet their needs. And here's what we know about healthcare coverage. There are about 240,000 Georgians who make low incomes and may qualify for pathways to coverage, but only 6,500 of them have enrolled. And you can read more about that in Leah's report on our website. We repeatedly hear Governor Kemp and other leaders in our state touting Georgia as the best state to do business in, but we have to ask, best for whom? And if you're wondering, the publication that names us the best state is called Area Development. Have you ever heard of that before? But that has named Georgia the best state to do business in for 10 consecutive years across a number of measurable outcomes. But let's talk about some other measurements in Georgia. CNBC's annual America's Top State for Business ranking considers quality of life among 10 categories of competitiveness, and Georgia is number 4. Yes, Georgia has attracted significant business investment, and our economic statistics on the surface can look impressive, but behind the headline numbers behind the numbers lies a more complex and concerning reality. When we talk about the best state to do business, we also need to talk about what that means for Georgia's working families. Because while companies may thrive, far too many Georgians are struggling to keep up. When we think about things like low wages and job quality, underinvestment in communities, equity gaps, businesses that don't always create equal opportunity. If we want to be the best, not just for business, but for all Georgians, then we need to redefine success. It's not enough to attract companies if workers can't earn a living wage, families can't afford childcare, and students can't access quality education. Being the best should mean being the most equitable, the healthiest, and the most opportunity-rich, not just for some, but for everyone. So while the governor celebrates Georgia's ranking for business, I ask you to join me in focusing on a much more important ranking. How are we doing as a state for our people? That's the measure of success that truly matters. So how are we doing? Best state to live in is debatable due to potentially concerns regarding areas like education quality, healthcare access, and certain demographic disparities, depending on individual priorities and lifestyle needs. We are possibly a great state because we have good economic opportunity, low cost of living comparatively, but that really depends on where you live in the state. We have nice climate variety and diverse landscapes and thriving cities. But we are concerned about our education quality, our healthcare access, and social issues that create social disparities and a lack of inclusivity. World News Report ranks Georgia as the 18th state best when taking into account like criminal justice system, economy, education, or healthcare. To ensure the best state to work in, you can consider factors like employment rate, average salary, cost of living, job market, diversity, quality of life, and so on, or a favorable living environment for workers. Oxfam's Best State to Work in 2024 index is an index based on state policies in 3 dimensions: wages, worker protections, and right to organize. You want to know where Georgia ranks? 50th. Wallet Hub ranks Georgia's 40th in the best state to raise a family in 2025. Wallet Hub compares the 50 states across dimensions like family fun, health and safety, education and childcare, affordability, and social economics. Again, that ranking puts us at 40th. So you can see, we have a lot of work to do to make Georgia as good for its people, its families, and communities as it is for businesses. And today you'll hear about some of the opportunities to do just that. So y'all, let's dig into the budget. First up is Danny Canso, GBPI's Senior Fiscal Analyst and Legislative Director. And Danny's overview of the amended year and fiscal year proposed budgets have been printed, a few copies on your tables and shared with you, also published on our website this morning. Danny, let me hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Stacy, and good morning. It's wonderful to see a full house here. Thank you all for joining us today. And so, as Stacy said, I will be discussing an overview of the governor's executive budget proposal for the amended year, the current year that we're in now, and the fiscal year ahead. We'll be going through a lot of information rather quickly, but you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So please, if there's something that grabs your attention, feel free to jot it down, and then we'll have a QR code where you can submit that at the end of the presentation. But just to give a little bit of a kind of brief of why this matters, where we are today, each year the governor submits 2 budget proposals. And in Georgia, that is the foundation for the legislative process where the budget begins, and then it moves to the House, and then the Senate for consideration, and then they join together to kind of resolve any differences that they have. And so the amended budget carries us through June 30th. We're about halfway through the fiscal year right now, and the full budget takes effect July 1st and then goes through the following year. So to get started, I think it's important to kind of point out where the state gets our money, how we raise funds, and then we'll talk about some of the big developments, changes, where that money is going, and some of the opportunities on the horizon. So in Georgia, truly the income tax is where we get the lion's share of our revenue. About 50 cents out of every dollar is collected through the income tax. Most of that comes from the individual income tax. You can see that we're anticipating about $18.9 billion of income tax revenue. About $15.7 billion of that comes from the individual income tax. It's important to also note here, this is the governor's revenue estimate. So the governor has unilateral control to set this estimate with advice from the state economist. On the next slide, we'll look a little bit at the surplus that we've generated over the past few years. And so the governor can set that revenue estimate conservatively, and that caps the amount of revenue that the General Assembly can appropriate. So we also look at the trends. We look at kind of our accounting of where things have been in the past, where they're likely to head. But these numbers are very important because that kind of limits what the General Assembly can then appropriate. Our next largest source of revenue is the sales tax. About a quarter of every dollar the state raises. In Georgia, we are one of a very few set of states that essentially tax no services. And so our sales tax tends to be on the more regressive side. If we look at trends throughout history, we see income taxes growing as a share of revenue, sales taxes generally decreasing. Then you can see kind of a collection of various taxes and fees make up about 14% of the budget. Those go into general funds, and then about 10% of the budget is designated. So those are areas where the Constitution specifically says those revenues have to go to certain areas of spending. So examples of that, the lottery has to fund pre-K and higher education scholarships. Motor fuel, gas taxes fund infrastructure, and then we have a couple of smaller sources of revenue that are distributed throughout the budget as well. So as Stacy pointed out, the surplus has been on everyone's minds for several years now, and you can kind of see the trends here. We'll dig in a little bit deeper on the next slide, but this just gives you sort of an overarching picture of where we are today and how that's built up really since the pandemic era. And you know, I'll note here, you see this undesignated surplus balance for the first time starting in 2021. That's the first time in our state's history that we filled up our revenue shortfall reserve, which is kind of the state's traditional savings account. That's capped at 15% of last year's revenue. And so every dollar above that in surplus goes into this undesignated account. And so you can see starting in 2021, we started building that up to where we are today, which is about $11.5 billion. You can also see here that we haven't spent any of that undesignated reserve. Last year, the governor allocated part of it as part of the revenue estimate, but again, because the revenue estimate was below what the state collected in taxes, we didn't spend those funds, and we actually added about $900 million cumulatively to the surplus accounts. This year, it looks like that may be a little bit different. We'll talk about that as well. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the lottery fund surplus. That's an area where the state has continued to spend under our capacity as well. Those are designated to the same areas as lottery funds are in general, higher education and pre-K, but that's another unique area where the state also has a lot of capacity to do more as well. So this chart takes you through kind of what I was just describing. You can see that during the Great Recession, we drew our revenue shortfall reserve down close to zero, about $100 million. The purpose of that account is created in the mid-'70s, and it was expanded after the Great Recession, is when state revenues dip in a recession or to manage against instability, we can tap into that account to avoid making sharp spending cuts or tax hikes. And so we've used that account throughout history to do that, to keep the budget stable. But what's unusual is starting during 2021 and forward, we've accumulated this undesignated surplus. And so that has really created a new policy question and a new opportunity for the governor and lawmakers to say, how can we use those surplus dollars to benefit Georgians and on behalf of Georgians? And so, you know, but before we go into the budget for next fiscal year, a few highlights of the budget for the next 6 months, the AFY 2025 budget. And I'll say again, as Stacy said, we have our budget overview available now online. Some of y'all will have copies at your table. So this will go into much more detail about kind of beyond just these figures. These are sort of some top lines that jump out. But kind of the heading, the big development is that in this amended fiscal year, we are on track to spend more money in one-time appropriations than in our state's history. About $6 billion overall, which is really a massive amount to obligate in a single year. Many of those funds are going to long-term expenses as well. So you can see about $1.6 billion for long-term infrastructure projects. Usually the state would bond those, which means that we would finance them over a long period of time. There are a lot of reasons why you do that. It helps to make sure that taxpayers are paying for those projects as they're being used rather than just current taxpayers footing the bill well into the future. It also allows us to take advantage of our AAA bond rating, which is the highest rating that a state can have. That allows us to borrow at the lowest rates possible so that we can kind of get the biggest bang for our buck there over long-time expenses. We started doing this last year and kind of foregoing bonds for these long-term projects and paying in cash. And the governor's budget sort of takes that to a new level this year with $1.6 billion in the amended fiscal year, another $900 million next year. Those funds, if the General Assembly so chooses, you could finance the same projects with bonds, and then that's how we've usually operated. We have $1 billion in this budget for one-time tax rebates. Those are non-refundable, so that means you can only get up to the amount that you pay in income taxes. But that would be up to $500 for couples filing married jointly, $375 for head of households, $250 for individuals. We've done that before. But again, kind of a one-time policy. $840 million for transportation projects within the DOT. So those are a little bit different than what we bond over a long term. Some of those are local grants to communities for their own work. Some of them are kind of a variety of other projects. About $800 million for the Department of Community Affairs. Again, most of that money is going to pay for sort of long-term infrastructure projects, wastewater, coastal resurfacing, things like that. About $650 million to recover from the damage caused by Hurricane Helene. About $100 million of that backfills the revenue that the state lost from suspending its gas tax. About $500 million for the employee retirement system. That's relevant because state retirees haven't had a cost of living increase in a very long time. Although the governor can't authorize that directly, this kind of opens up that possibility. $280 million for the Department of Corrections. Many of y'all have heard about sort of the really crisis happening in our state prison system. A lot of that money is kind of making overdue improvements and helping to improve security. And then $50 million in one-time funds for school security grants, about $22,000 for every school across the state. So again, most of the changes in the amended year budget are kind of one-time funding, and we really see pretty unprecedented level, and that brings us to $41.6 billion for the current fiscal year. Next year's budget is $37.7 billion. And what we see here is really generally a pretty flat budget for most state agencies. The lion's share of increases are coming to respond to enrollment growth and other kind of mandatory program increases that we have to make to sort of keep policy level with where it is. But you can see as we look at sort of the division between the entire budget, most of what the state does is healthcare and education. So about 73 cents of every dollar goes to healthcare and education. You can see pre-K through 12th grade is the largest share of that, about $14.3 billion. Higher ed adds another $5.5 billion. That gets us to a majority, beyond a majority of state spending, another $7.7 billion in health spending, about 20% of what the state does. 9% goes to transportation. That includes kind of those one-time funds that we're spending in cash rather than bonding. You can see criminal legal systems next. And then about 20 state agencies take up just 4% of spending. So again, really dominant focus on healthcare and education throughout the budget. And when we look at kind of the increases in this budget, about $1.6 billion, what we see is out of that net $1.6 billion, 98% of those funds are going across healthcare and education. And the majority of that is responding to kind of enrollment increases and just keeping programmatic spending level with what the state demands. So that kind of comes through things like Medicaid, where those costs go up, often above the rate of inflation. So we're just trying to keep pace there in most of these areas. What we also see that kind of continues a big spike that we saw last year is that the state is spending a good bit more for its state health benefit plan. So educators across the state are also enrolled in the state health benefit plan. We see a 7% increase this year. Last year we saw a 67% increase. So now the rate is about $1,860 per member per month. The state pays the employer share of that. Local school districts also pay the share of that for employees who aren't considered certified. So that's school bus drivers, janitors, folks like that. And what we estimate generally is that local school districts will pay about the same amount as the state. It's sort of a 50-50 distribution in terms of the employees that are covered. So about $174 million of that as local districts consider what kind of capping property taxes could mean. This is one of the variables that they're going to have to weigh. About $140 million is added here to fund the first year of the new voucher program that was created, the $6,500 voucher for those who are eligible. So that is set to go online here. about $30 million for transportation for K through 12 schools. This is an area that at GBPI we've really called attention to over the years, pointed out as a major need for the state. And so as part of that, $20 million is kind of financing school buses. That'll buy us about 227 school buses. That is just scratching the surface. We estimate that about a third of school buses on the road right now are 15 years or older. It's a huge need for districts. It's continued to eat up a larger share of local funding as the state share has dropped. Last year, we did have a pretty big increase for what's called the Pupil Transportation Grant. So we took that up by about $200 million. And now the state is paying about 30% of overall transportation costs. There was a time where the state was paying a majority of those costs about 30 years ago, and steadily that's kind of ticked down. Last year we got a big adjustment, and we're adding about $10 million more to that. But again, local districts are kind of shouldering most of those costs. And then you can see here, $81 million for Hope scholarships, $324 million for Medicaid and Peach Care. Really, most of that money is just going to kind of keep the program steady, respond to increased costs. And then about $14 million as part of a program that was approved last year to reduce pre-K sizes from 22 to 20. That's going to be phased in over an additional 2 years, so we can expect more money for that as well. So as we talk about kind of these one-time expenses, the state reducing the projects that we pay for with bonds and paying in cash instead, this is kind of the trend that we're looking at. And you can see over the last 15 years or so, we've steadily ticked down bonding less, paying more in cash for infrastructure. The reason that's important is because if we do that, we have less recurring revenue available for ongoing needs, for salaries, for programs, for services, and instead of bonding and using our AAA bond rating to get the lowest rates available, we're spending cash. And so that's subtracting from other areas of the budget. And you can see really that's kind of breaking with historical precedent and just kind of emblematic of an approach that the governor has really prioritized here. You can kind of just see how we're less reliant on debt. And by the way, this is something that the General Assembly could change. We could fund the same projects, but just finance them over a long period of time, and that frees up resources in the current year. And so we kind of point out two phenomena here, where we're building up our surplus with recurring spending by keeping the revenue estimate low, and we're also paying cash for long-term obligations. So we're reducing the amount of kind of recurring revenue that we have for regular recurring expenses by doing that too. So we're kind of pushing those budget levels down on two ends and increasing the amount of cash that we're spending for long-term expenses instead of kind of taking care of those day-to-day needs. So another big factor that's informing the revenue estimate are the recent decisions that the state has made on the income tax. So Stacey kind of gave the top line on this, where the governor's proposed accelerating a plan that was approved a couple of years ago to reduce what's now a flat income tax rate on both individual and corporate revenue from 5.39 to 5.19%. So that comes at a total cost of about $748 million. And you can see here kind of how that benefits different income groups. They're broken out into 20% of kind of households, and then the top 20% is broken out into the next 15, the next 4, and then the top 1%. So for the median household in Georgia, that is worth about $70 per year when we make that change. And when we look at, okay, for the first 80% of tax filers, and we add up the percentage of the $748 million that they would gain, it's about 33%. So those in the top 20% would gain about $500 million out of that $750 million. So what this in effect does is it expands the gap of income inequality across the state. And when we cut taxes from the top down, what we're doing is giving the greatest benefits to those who are earning the highest incomes. And so you can see just kind of, what that means for the state as a whole. And I'll just also say that last year we approved another plan which cut the income tax from 5.49% to 5.39%. It also cut the corporate income tax down, which had been a bit higher, at 5.75%. And so last year that cost about $600 million. So we continue to reduce the amount that we can collect from income taxes. And overall, what we find is basically that makes the state's tax system a bit more regressive, where those who earn the least are paying a larger share of their income. Those who earn the most, although they represent the most income in the economy, they're paying a lower share of what they earn in overall taxes. So another proposal that we've heard from the lieutenant governor, members of the Senate, has been to fund a state child tax credit. And this is a policy that research has shown can be really effective in distributing resources to families. We think that it's a very good idea for the state to pursue this. But it's also important to say that that credit should be refundable. And again, what that means is that if you're a low-income family, you would get the full credit that you're eligible for, which is based on the number of children that you have, rather than being capped out to the amount of taxes that you pay. So for those very low-income families, this is how making it refundable is how we can make sure they get that full value and can provide for their children. But what you can see here is, in contrast to that last chart, if we do something like this, across income groups, folks are generally getting about the same amount. And so that makes it a much more equitable policy, stretches those dollars a bit further. Also, as Stacey mentioned, there are potentially significant federal changes on the horizon that we continue to hear a little bit more about every day. But just to zoom out a bit, the state is dependent on the federal government for a significant portion of our budget. So if we look at the governor's proposal for 2026, there's about $22 billion that we expect to come from the federal government and that we're relying on for state programs. Most of that is going to Medicaid. You can see about 61% is health care in general. Some of that goes to public health. Some of it goes to behavioral health. About 13%, and that's about $14 billion overall. About 13% or $2.9 billion is going to pre-K through 12th grade education. About $2.3 billion, 10% to higher education. And then you can see kind of downward from there. Also get a significant amount for transportation. Our human services budget, actually, we get more money from the federal government than the state contributes. So that's very important, really sensitive to potential changes there. So you can just see how much we rely on those federal funds. So what can we expect there? There are a few deadlines that we know that we can anticipate. The first is March 14th. Of this year, so just a couple months away. That's when federal funding expires under the continuing resolution that was passed in December. So that is a big point where Congress has to act to keep funding going for the remainder of the fiscal year. And then we're going to reach the debt ceiling, which is the point at which the federal government can no longer borrow to meet its obligations. So we have a hard cap on that. We don't know exactly when it's going to be reached yet. It kind of depends on tax collections and a couple of other things, but generally estimates are around spring or summer of 2025. So again, another deadline coming there. A big package of tax changes was passed in late 2017 called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Renewal of that is estimated to cost $4.6 trillion, and that expires in December. So that has set up this big kind of fiscal cliff at various points of the year. The most likely way that Congress is going to address these issues is through a process called reconciliation. And so that's provided for under sort of federal budget law, and basically it allows Congress to make spending decisions on the debt limit, and for borrowing through a process that requires a lower vote threshold in the Senate. So rather than 60 votes, it's a 50-vote threshold. The catch is that Senate rules kind of restrict what you can put in that measure. So generally, the policies have to be related to the federal budget. The decision on that is kind of up to Senate rules and the parliamentarian. It kind of becomes a wonky process. But in general, we would expect that to be really a primarily budget-focused process, not a ton of policy. So just as I conclude, and as we think about the environment and the decisions ahead for the state, again, The governor's budget for 2026 is relatively flat. For 2025, we have an unprecedented amount of one-time spending. But because we're deciding to spend such a large portion of resources in cash rather than financing, there are a lot of opportunities available for lawmakers. They could do everything that we're recommending, and just by kind of maneuvering how we're paying for it, more in line with what we've traditionally done, free up a really significant amount of resources. And so as we think about kind of what should some of those top priorities be, there are sort of 4 areas that we look to. The first is childcare. In this state, we really have a childcare crisis. That was identified by a study committee that was looking at kind of the landscape in Georgia. Estimates have shown that upwards of $1.75 billion annually is lost in economic productivity because families don't have adequate access to childcare. And so I think you'll hear a little bit more about this today, but we've proposed a dedicated child care trust fund using a portion of the state surplus as a way to bring on a new source of recurring revenue that could help make a big dent in that. We also think that state employees should have salaries that are commensurate with the work that they do. Georgia's really struggled with a high turnover rate in recent years. Last year, it was lower than it's been, but it's still 18% year over year. We're losing 18% of the state workforce. And so we need to be paying them adequately, particularly those who are on the front lines managing critical programs. In the budget that we have proposed today, very few state employees are getting cost of living increases. Really, that's limited to the university system and a couple of other really narrow positions. But for the most part, folks are seeing their salaries frozen. Another area that we see real value in contributing to is making our education formula more equitable. So we call it an opportunity weight, which as we look across the nation, 44 other states have something like this, where they have a dedicated funding formula that responds to low-income students, students in poverty, and adds a bit more money to districts to account for the challenges that they face in helping to make sure those students have the same opportunities as others. In Georgia, also, we have a student counselor ratio of 1 to 450 that's funded. The best practice that's recommended by sort of the American Counselor Association is 1 to 250. And for many rural districts, when you think about having a smaller school, that means that they really struggle to even fund a single position, and that can be really damaging for mental health for what we're offering students. Again, Georgia, in our next year budget, we add about 1%, less than 1% to the public health budget. That's an area of government that's been relatively flat in recent years. You'll hear more from my colleague Leah Chan about that. And so as we come out of the pandemic, as we think about how public health could reduce preventable deaths, strengthen healthcare in communities, especially as we have such a high rate of uninsured Georgians, this is an area where we could really get a very strong return on relatively low investment and improve the quality of life of folks across the state. And as I talked about, we see a child tax credit as one of the most important policies that we could enact to help level the playing field in our tax code and also respond to a real and immediate need facing families all across the state. So I know that was a lot, and now we'll kind of take a bit of time for questions, and I'll welcome my colleague Erin Robinson, our Director of Outreach and Strategic Campaigns, to join me.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, great. So you might be thinking, I don't see a microphone at the front of the room. How am I going to ask questions? So if you want to take your program and open it up, you'll see a QR code at the top of the right page that will tell you how to use Mentimeter. So what you're going to do is either use that QR code and it'll take you right there, or go to Menti, that's MENTI.com, and you're going to put in our specific code. That code is 8640-7796. That's 8640-7796. And that's also in your printed agendas. So if you need to ask questions, just go ahead and put them in, and they will come directly to my iPad. All right, so while y'all are thinking of your questions or getting set up on Menti, I'll get started with some questions for Danny. So Danny, in your budget overview, you say that the total for fiscal year 2026 is $41.6 billion. That's a difference of $1 billion from what we see in the governor's proposal. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, and this is really simple, quick, but basically that $1 billion one-time rebate is not accounted for right now in the 2026 budget. So you might see figures of 40.6 billion elsewhere. When we add in that $1 billion rebate, it takes us up to 41.6. So we're just kind of trying to count the full array of obligations here with that.
Great. And we already have some questions coming in on Mentimeter. I love that y'all are using this. So first question from there is, why do you think there is an 18% turnover of state workers?
Yeah, I mean, as we look at kind of the positions where turnover is highest, it tends to be in these really high demand areas where employees are tasked with doing a lot and paid relatively little. The correction system is at the top of that list. And when we've heard from those agency leaders in the past, they've said, we are struggling to recruit against basically fast food and the fast food industry for our employees. They don't want the burden that comes along with this job for such low pay. And so the state, for a long time during the Great Recession and those years and the immediate after, shed a lot of state employees. That means that the workload is stretched thinner on more folks and was slow to respond to kind of match the market in terms of pay. And so the result of that is we had a lot to catch up on. And so there were efforts made in the last couple of years to try to do these one-time adjustments to help to level some of those salaries out. At one time, we were seeing a turnover rate of 25%. And so as those changes were made, we saw a little bit of a tick down. But still, I think most of us can agree that 18% is too high. And when we see a year like this where we're not even making cost of living adjustments, we're not accounting for categories of particularly high turnover like eligibility workers, we're sort of setting ourselves up for a rebound potentially where those numbers could tick back up even though they're already pretty high.
So it seems that the executive budget proposal for next year, fiscal year 2026, is relatively flat. What is contributing to that lower revenue estimate, and what does it mean for people across Georgia?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things. So we talked about the proposed income tax cut for this year. $750 million is a pretty costly program to implement. The way that that's structured is that it would go into effect January 1st of 2025. So it's actually retroactive. And if we think about just the recent history, last year we implemented the other tax cut I mentioned, going to the flat tax in general, lowering the corporate tax rate from 5.75 to 5.39. We're taking that further now, both rates to 5.19. Last year's program was about $600 million. And so when you just start to add that up, it makes sense that we are collecting less in income tax revenue, which as we started with, you can see is where the state gets most of its money. We are reliant on the income tax. We depend on the income tax to be able to keep up with changes in employment, changes in salary. Inflation is reflected there more so than in many other sources of revenue. And so it's really important that we have a strong income tax to be able to keep pace in revenues. And then when we look at the actual budget, you see that we're making the decision to use a lot more recurring revenue on one-time expenses rather than to bond it. If you bond it, your annual expense for the same program would be much less because you're financing it over a long period of time. If you think about when you make major purchases, a car, a house, you're likely not to pay in cash for that, but to finance it because you're going to use it for a long period of time, and so you want to spread the costs out over a long period of time. When we use cash for those types of investments, kind of, we put more pressure on the budget as well.
Has Governor Kemp indicated his position or response to President Trump's goal of shifting more costs to states? Have you seen any anticipation of this within this current budget proposal?
We really don't see any anticipation of that in the proposal. And actually, to the contrary, $22 billion in federal funding is higher than we've seen in recent years. So the state is actually expecting to receive more in federal funding than we have in kind of the last few years. And so, I mean, I think we've seen just very vague details. I think it's really hard to account for potential changes. But I think what we know for certain is that particularly in Medicaid, particularly in human services, education as well, we would be really sensitive to potential cuts. We depend on those federal formulas to make sure that we can finance those programs. And if resources there were to drop, it would be really challenging to kind of make our budget work as it currently stands.
So we've got a surplus question that came in. Is the undesignated surplus restricted at all? And you mentioned the Child Care Trust Fund, and they also asked, how can this be used responsibly to meet the equity demands of our state?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer to the first part is no. And actually, there is nothing in the law that provides for the undesignated surplus. It was kind of a policy question that state leaders didn't anticipate. We didn't think that we would fill our revenue shortfall reserve to capacity and that we would continue to build up surplus above that. There have been pieces of legislation in recent years to try to account for that. They haven't made it to the governor's desk. So as part of the governor's revenue estimate, the Georgia law also gives the governor power to release reserves. The threshold that we have to cross to release reserves is 4%. So that's about $1.5 billion in reserves that we have to maintain. The rainy day fund now is $5.5 billion, and above that we have about $11.5 billion in undesignated reserves. So we are way past kind of what we anticipate in the law in terms of releasing it. It's a little bit tricky though, because to release those funds and to appropriate those funds, the governor kind of has decision-making authority as part of the revenue estimate. So the governor has unilateral authority to set the revenue estimate. The only way to possibly get around that would be a constitutional amendment, where the General Assembly alone can amend the Constitution. It's above the threshold of a veto, and so the governor generally doesn't weigh in on those and can't block that. So for example, a Child Care Trust Fund could be created through a constitutional amendment, and that would be a way for the General Assembly to say, we want to dedicate these resources going forward to that type of account.
Great. So this is a question about one of your slides. Of the $6 billion in one-time expenses proposed on Danny's first slide, what would be surplus dollars and what is paid through current year revenues?
Yeah, so it's we don't really designate for most of these areas where the funding comes from. So at the top of the revenue, the only exception to that really, there are a couple of minor ones, but the main one is the tax rebates. The governor says in there that his intention is to fund that with undesignated funds. When we look across most of the other areas, the revenue estimate is what sets the amount that the state can appropriate, and the governor said his intention is to set aside $2.7 billion from the undesignated reserves as part of that. So that goes into the total. The tricky thing is that in that estimate, they're not accounting for $1 billion of the rebate in the first place. So it's a little bit convoluted right now. But the short answer is most of those expenses are being paid with recurring revenues as the budget is structured right now. And hopefully as the appropriations process moves forward, that will kind of be corrected and we'll get a little bit more clarity. And this week, unfortunately, because of the ice storm, appropriations hearings were canceled. For the most part. And so that's where you usually get a little bit more of that information. You get the state economist, the OPB director, the governor generally speaks as well. It's an opportunity for lawmakers to ask those questions. We haven't gotten that yet. And so really we're just at the very beginning of the budget process. Stacey says we pull this analysis together really from that document in about a week. And so this is kind of the starting point, and we'll start to fill in many more of those gaps as we go forward.
Great. So we're at our time for those questions, but I have two very quick answer questions for you to try to get as many as possible in. And these are both related to education. These will be our last questions here. Have you heard any justification for why we haven't added an opportunity weight? And do you know anything about whether the state plans to help fund the increases in the teacher retirements?
Yeah, well, I don't know about short answer, but
I don't even know why I tried.
my colleague Ashley Young will discuss this as well, and is our education policy expert. But I'll just say, when we fund schools, we really do that through the QBE funding formula, which originated in the mid-1980s. And so there are various aspects of that that try to respond to needs. There's equalization, there's the 5 mil share that responds to property tax wealth. But what we're doing is we're operating under the current system, and we're kind of trying to bring up the lowest wealth districts to the median of where we are. We're not accounting for further needs like we would be with a poverty weight, an opportunity weight. And so, you know, it's a glaring gap that we don't have, and part of the reason is because we have a legacy funding model that hasn't been updated, and when we have made changes, it's been on the margins, and it's been generally to lower the obligations. So we used to equalize districts to the 75th percentile. Now we equalize them to the 50th percentile. We used to fund a greater share of transportation costs. Now we fund about 30% of transportation costs. So we've seen things move downward, unfortunately, rather than kind of keep pace or increase. And so we've heard a lot of interest about that from various lawmakers. A lot of folks say it's time to update that funding formula. It's time to account for kind of the modern system that we have. And so I know we'll have more discussion of that with Ashley, so I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Danny.
Yeah, thank you.
So if you asked Danny a question in Mentimeter and we didn't get to it, no worries. We will be keeping those questions, and we'll respond via email to attendees. So please share your questions, and as the sessions are going on and the presentations are happening, please feel free to submit your questions while they're happening, because we're going to roll right into the Q&A. As you have seen, my colleagues have a lot of information to share, so we are going to keep it rolling, but please feel free to get up, take care of yourself, etc. So now we're going to transition to our health and housing panel with our Director of Health Justice, Leah Chan, and our CBPP Health Policy Fellow, Hillary Dong. So we'll start with the budget overviews for relevant agencies and then move to questions. So as I said, please feel free to submit your questions as Hillary and Leah are talking. And as a reminder, that's menti.com, and the code is 86407796. You can also find that in your printed agenda. Take it away, Hillary.
Thank you.
Do you want me to?
Is that correct? Okay, cool. Can y'all hear me? Perfect. So I am Hillary Dong. I am the Health Policy Fellow here at GBPI. And as a part of our work on state health policy, I have been working on state housing policy recently. So some of y'all might be wondering, how are health and housing connected? Well, housing is an underlying driver of people's health outcomes. So you can think of it this way. If you're living in unsafe housing conditions, say for instance you have mold in your home, you might start to notice that you're developing new health issues. Maybe you have a cough that you've never had before, or your brain starts to feel foggy in a way that it hasn't. Or if you have an existing condition like asthma, you might notice that condition starting to get worse. Or say, for instance, if you can barely make your rent every month, you might not have enough money left over to buy groceries or to go see the doctor if you get sick. And if you're constantly worried about whether or not you can pay your rent, about that leak that you keep asking your landlord to fix, but for some reason they just won't, or you're worried about if you might get evicted, or you have received an eviction notice, those things cause a lot of stress, and that can take a serious toll on people's mental health. And these health impacts are important to note because, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, Georgia is in the middle of a pretty serious housing crisis. Housing production, housing supply has not kept up with the state's continued population growth, and so that mismatch in supply and demand has contributed to an increase in housing prices. And we see that in 2022, nearly half of all Georgia renters were experiencing housing cost burden, meaning that they were spending at least 30% of their income on their housing. And actually, about a quarter of Georgia renters were spending half or more of their income on housing. And across the state, about over 1.1 million Georgia households, that's both renters and homeowners, are experiencing housing cost burden. And it probably comes as no surprise that this housing cost burden disproportionately affects communities of color. We see that about 49% of Black Georgia renters and 47% of Latino Georgia renters experience housing cost burden compared to 36% of white renters in the state. And according to HUD's Continuum of Care Homelessness Assistance Program counts, homelessness increased by about 20% between 2020 and 2024. And homelessness is notably pretty difficult to count and to quantify in this way, so this is just one count, but whatever numbers you're looking at, homelessness has been increasing in the last several years. So, looking at all of this, with all of this in mind, what has the governor proposed for housing in the state budget for the amended fiscal year 2025 and fiscal year 2026? What we see in his budget report are no increases for the state's housing programs. Funding remains flat from the fiscal year 2025 budget that was passed last year. And in total, this is about $34.4 million out of the $37 billion in state funds that we have for the in the governor's proposed FY 2026 budget. That's about 0.001% of state funds that are going towards housing, so about 1/1000th. And you might be wondering which state programs, which state agencies are actually responsible for administering these housing programs. We have the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, DBHDD, which does a lot of important work, and my colleague Leah will go into that more later. But for housing, what's most relevant is that they operate the Georgia Housing Voucher Program. We also have the Department of Community Affairs, DCA, which operates most of the state's housing programs. They're responsible for housing and community and economic development in the state. So let's dig into this a little bit more. That biggest chunk of change that we saw in that pie graph was for the Georgia Housing Voucher Program, which, as I mentioned, is administered by DBHDD. The Georgia Housing Voucher Program was established over 14 years ago to meet the state's obligation under the Olmstead Settlement Agreement to house 9,000 individuals with severe and persistent mental illness who are cycling through the state's criminal legal systems, hospitals, and emergency rooms. At the start of the pandemic, for the fiscal year 2021 budget, the Georgia Housing Voucher Program experienced a significant cut in funding, and since then, its funding has never returned to pre-pandemic levels. Currently, the program serves about 2,300 individuals, but as housing costs and demand for services increase, the cost to operate this program has also increased. Obviously, we are not fulfilling that obligation of housing 9,000 individuals under the Georgia Housing Voucher Program currently. And in order to meet that obligation under the Olmstead Settlement Agreement, we need to increase the funding for the Georgia Housing Voucher Program. We just can't do it at the current rate of funding that we have. Next, looking at DCA. While we do see a reorganization and a consolidation of programs under DCA in the FY 2026 budget, what we don't see is a significant increase in state funding. The governor's proposed FY 2026 budget includes just under $1 million added to DCA's budget, or an increase of about 1.4%. We do see $28 million for the Rural Workforce Housing Initiative in the amended fiscal year 2025 budget. However, I do want to note that that is run by the One Georgia Authority, which is attached to DCA for administrative purposes, but is technically its own separate thing, and that the Rural Workforce Housing Initiative funds grants that support infrastructure for the construction of rural workforce housing, but it doesn't fund housing directly. We also see that funding remains level for the Georgia Stable Housing Accountability Program, which was established by House Majority Leader Chuck Efstration's bill last session. That funding remains flat at $1 million, and we also see that funding remains level for the State Housing Trust Fund for the homeless. So the State Housing Trust Fund for the homeless was created in 1989, and it has the broad legal authority to expend non-lapsing funds for the creation and preservation of low to moderate income housing and to support home ownership initiatives. Since it was created, funding has largely remained stagnant at around $3 million for decades. although in recent years we have seen some increases to the program. In the amended fiscal year 2024 budget, we saw $2.9 million added to leverage federal grant funds for the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project. And in FY 2025, we saw $4.6 million to improve homelessness services and to address and to pursue federal grant opportunities. Funds from the State Housing Trust Fund for the Homeless are largely distributed to organizations addressing homelessness through small grants. And in FY 2023, we saw that every $1 in the State Housing Trust Fund leveraged over $10 in federal funds. And all of this is to say that when we're looking at these flat budgets for these housing programs, when the state is choosing to stagnate state funding for housing, the state is making a choice to underutilize the critical tools that it has at its disposal to address the state's housing crisis. Given the state of the housing crisis that we are experiencing and that I'm sure all of us are feeling in one way or another, Georgia should be investing significantly more into these programs, into the Georgia Housing Voucher Program, into the State Housing Trust Fund, into all of these tools that we have, but we're just not using to their full capacity. Ultimately, we can't fix what we don't fund. So when we're looking at these flat budgets, what we're seeing is that the housing crisis is going to get worse because we're not doing enough to address the issue at hand. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague Leah Chan to look at the rest of the health budget.
All right, good morning. So I am here to talk to you about, can you hear me? Yes, all right. I am here to talk to you about our state health agencies. So the Departments of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, Community Health, and Public Health are our primary agencies focused on our state's healthcare and public health systems. So the governor proposes allocating more than $7.7 billion in state funds for these three agencies in the fiscal year 2026 budget, which is overall about a 4.5% increase from the prior fiscal year. So as you can see, the amount that's actually allocated to each department is really starkly different. So let's say that we have 10 state dollars to spend on health. 7 of those dollars would go to Department of Community Health, 2 of those dollars would go to Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, and less than 1 of those dollars would go towards Department of Public Health. Next slide. So I'm going to be throwing a lot of numbers your way, so I wanted to start with just sort of a brief overview across all 3 health agency budgets. So let's start with what's working. So we know that from 2020 to about mid-2023, many low-income Georgians in our state had uninterrupted access to health care thanks to a pandemic-era policy that provided continuous Medicaid eligibility. And in April 2023, that policy began to unwind. And we saw during that process that a significant proportion of children covered by Medicaid and Peach Care were losing access to coverage, not because they were no longer eligible, but for paperwork reasons. And so that's why this new policy is really exciting. So the federal government is mandating that all children up to age 19 or under age 19 have continuous eligibility so that they do not lose that coverage for procedural reasons. So you see that budget item in the Department of Community Health budget. And we know that there's a whole lot of data that shows that children who grow up with consistent access to Medicaid, they do better in school, they have better health outcomes, they make more money, they pay more taxes. We also see that consistent coverage actually reduces the state's administrative costs by reducing the number of children who are, again, churning in and out of the system and then having to reapply. So another thing that we see in this budget is annualizing provider rate increases. So we know that there have been a lot of issues around finding community-based providers to serve Georgians with lower incomes because the reimbursement rates are quite low. And so this annualizes some important provider rate increases that were included in the prior year budget. So let's skip to the end and talk about what's missing. Since becoming its own state agency in 2011, the Department of Public Health's budget has remained comparatively low. And although general fund appropriations for the department have doubled since 2011, it has never surpassed the $500 million mark. And we see yet again that there's very little investment, very little increase in this year's public health budget. We also know that there has been momentum in the past several years around addressing maternal mortality, but the budget this year really largely fails to meet the scale of the problem. We know that there are too many women dying before, during, and after pregnancy, even though most of those deaths are preventable. And so lastly, what's not working? So we'll talk more about this later on the slides, but the state's Pathways to Coverage program has seen low enrollment and high overall cost. And we know, of course, that it covers fewer people at a higher cost than if we were to fully expand Medicaid. And we see in general with our budget that it largely invests state dollars downstream, with much of our spending focused on catching people when they're already sick, already in crisis, and less investment in prevention and keeping people well. And it's really critical that we think about new ways to create the conditions where all Georgians have a fair and just opportunity at good health. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to dig into some of the numbers. So our Department of Public Health operates programs focused on disease and injury prevention, health promotion, and health-related disaster response and preparedness. And the governor's budget proposal adds about $3.8 million to the budget, most of which is accounted for by an increase for this home visiting pilot. It's now going to be available in 75 counties, and it supports women and children in at-risk and underserved rural communities during pregnancy and early childhood to really improve birth outcomes and reduce maternal mortality. Next slide. So again, we've seen that public health appropriations have really not kept pace with inflation and population growth. We know that compared to state per person funding in other states, Georgia ranks about 33rd out of the states with available information. And you can see, as illustrated by this graph, state general fund appropriations for public health have increased from about $18 per person in fiscal year 2012 to about $33 in fiscal year 2024. And the biggest year-to-year jump was fiscal year 2023, when we saw some salary increases for certain job categories. But despite this modest increase in state appropriations, the combined state and federal appropriations have actually decreased since fiscal year 2012 from about $92 per person to just $70 per person. Next slide. So we know that Georgia's health security and economic well-being really depend on a thriving, fully funded state and local public health system. We know that public health interventions like improved sanitation, family planning, those are the most significant contributors to Americans leading longer and healthier lives in the 20th and early 21st centuries. And we see from other states that increases in public health spending have been shown to reduce preventable deaths. And of course, healthier communities support healthier economies. So again, public health has historically been underfunded, particularly when compared to healthcare. We saw that less than 1 in every 10 state general fund dollars is spent on public health. And of course, total state and federal public health funding per person has declined over the past decade. And we see that in that same time period, death rates among children and among working age adults have actually increased. And we know that too many Georgians are dying too soon of preventable causes like suicide and drug overdose. So more funding alone is not going to lead to better health outcomes. We really need a broad coalition of support to sort of shape and champion a public health budget that supports a sustainable public health infrastructure. So that includes a well-trained, equitably paid, diverse workforce, nimble, actionable data system, while at the same time we also need to sort of reimagine the role that public health plays in creating the conditions where all of us can thrive. Next slide. Okay, so Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. So as Hillary mentioned, they operate state hospitals, they provide community-based services to Georgians living with mental health conditions, substance use disorders, and intellectual and developmental disabilities. So the government is proposing a $50 million increase in state funds. one of the largest buckets of funding will support Georgians living with intellectual and developmental disabilities, in part by annualizing and adding more waiver slots, and by annualizing the reimbursement rate for the providers who offer those services and supports, so that they can receive services in their homes and communities. It also annualizes a reimbursement rate increase that will provide about a 30% average increase in provider rates for community-based behavioral health providers. Next slide. Next slide. So as you can see from this side, the mental health services and developmental disability services funding lines have grown pretty substantially since fiscal year 2020. The largest being the developmental disability services, which has grown by 55%. Contrastingly, you see that the addictive diseases and substance abuse services lines have remained relatively stagnant, with only about a 1% increase over that same time period. Next slide. So, Department of Community Health administers our state Medicaid and Peach Care programs, which provide health care to folks with lower incomes. And the governor is proposing about a $274 million increase. So calling out some things that are not in the, specifically the Medicaid budget, but in the DCH budget. So states generally cover all FDA-approved drugs, and we have seen the price of prescription drugs have risen over time. And specifically in December 2023, the FDA approved 2 new therapies for the treatment of sickle cell disease, which in part accounts for this increase for new high-cost drugs. As I mentioned at the top, we're also seeing the increase for 12-month continuous coverage to help keep kids connected to care. And we also see funding for the PACE program, which provides comprehensive medical and social services to older adults. Next slide. So Medicaid and Peach Care really account for the lion's share of the Department of Community Health funding. The governor proposes to spend about $5.2 billion in fiscal year 2026. As you can see from the graph to our left, more than half of that funding goes to cover older adults and individuals with disabilities. However, it's actually children that make up about 71% of Medicaid and Peach Care enrollees. So largely this increase, the increase in funding between fiscal year 25 and 26 is primarily accounted for by projected growth in Medicaid enrollment and utilization, and that's primarily in the age blind and disabled category with his older adults, individuals with disabilities, and then in the low-income Medicaid category, which covers children, pregnant women, very low-income parents and caregivers, and then any of the adults who meet the Pathways qualifying activities requirement. All right, next slide. All right, so switching gears just a little bit. So we know that unequal access to affordable, high-quality health care continues to impact Georgians across our state. So Georgia is tied with Oklahoma for the second highest proportion of residents without access to health insurance. And we know that the burden is really heaviest on Georgians living in rural communities and Georgians of color, particularly Latinx Georgians. So in January 2023, Georgia launched the Pathways to Coverage program, which offers Medicaid, healthcare coverage through Medicaid to adults with lower incomes who do not have access to other forms of affordable health insurance. So to be eligible, they must work, go to school, volunteer, or complete some other qualifying activity for at least 80 hours per month. And the program really covers a lot of the same things as traditional Medicaid: doctor visits, hospital stays, prescriptions. So we're currently the only state in the nation to offer Medicaid coverage to uninsured adults contingent upon, this sort of work or qualifying activities requirement. So we at GBPI have been monitoring the implementation of this program. And here are a couple of key things that we found from the first year. So enrollment in the program really fell short of expectations and need. So it only achieved about 17% of its projected first-year enrollment, so it enrolled about 4,231 folks in the first year. And that in and of itself is still just a fraction of the estimated 240,000 Georgians living in the coverage gap who are potentially eligible for this program. And as you can see from the map, more than 40% of Georgia's counties still had fewer than 10 enrollees, again, despite us having one of the highest uninsured populations in the nation. We also know that the cumbersome enrollment process and that restrictive eligibility criteria appear to contribute to the program's lack of success in the first year. There's really a steep paperwork burden that people face, from learning about the program to completing a lengthy application to compiling all their documents to verify their hours and activities. So we see that there were about 110,000 Georgians who actually indicated interest in this program by signing a form that said, I want to apply, and I understand, that I have to comply with these different eligibility criteria. And of those 110,000 that indicated interest, only about 5% of them actually ended up enrolling, which really shows you that between showing that interest and actually getting in the program, there are quite a few landmines that people have to navigate. And lastly, Pathways is a really costly program for taxpayers. Next slide. So since the program was approved through the end of the first year, an average of $13,000 was spent per enrollee in combined state and federal funds. And we really see that it's spending on upgrades to technology that account for the largest proportion of total spending. So upgrades to Georgia's online eligibility and enrollment system were 5 times higher than spending on actual health care benefits for enrollees. Next slide. But there is a very important opportunity for all of us to engage to make this program better and ensure that as many people can enroll as possible. So currently, the department they are applying for an extension because the original program approval expires in September of 2025. So they currently have their extension application up online, and we are currently in the public comment period that runs through February 20th, 2025. So this is a great opportunity for those of you in the audience that would like to submit public comment with your perspective as a community member, patient, provider, advocate, or to attend one of these 2 public hearings. And we do see that in the extension application, there are some really important modifications being made, including previously enrollees were supposed to be reporting their qualifying activity on a monthly basis, which is a huge paperwork burden. They're removing that. They're removing premiums. And they're also adding new qualifying activities to hopefully remove some of those barriers for folks that do work, that do volunteer, that do go to school, but for whatever reason, were unable to be a part of the program. And you can visit georgiapathways.org for more resources and information about pathways to coverage in general. Next slide. Okay, so finally, I just wanted to touch really quick on federal landscape, specifically as it relates to healthcare. So in order to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporation, Congress is considering making some drastic cuts to Medicaid. And it's still unclear what those final cuts might look like, but most of the options that are on the table would really fundamentally change the structure of the program. And it would shift costs from the federal government to our state. And as Danny mentioned, federal Medicaid dollars alone account for about 20% of Georgia's total budget, and that really brings billions of dollars to our state. So a cut to those federal dollars would really force us to make a lot of really difficult decisions and really impact our state economy. So it's critical that collectively we are encouraging our federal delegation to protect Medicaid and really keep Georgia's economy thriving. And there are also drastic cuts being discussed for our federal public health agencies. Federal funding accounts for about half of our Department of Public Health's total budget. So drastic cuts to the federal budget for public health would have serious implications for our state and local public health system. We also know that the serious cuts could have implications for our Georgia-based federal workforce. So as all of you may know, most of CDC is headquartered in Atlanta, and so significant job losses there would have reverberations across the region. So even as we all have our attention focused on the General Assembly, it's really important to keep in mind sort of that interconnectedness between state budget and the federal appropriations process. So I'll hand it back to Erin.
All right, we got a lot of questions coming in, so we're going to jump on into it. It was mentioned that health services is a federal dependent fund category for the state. How might the recent freeze on HHS agencies impact state funding?
So I think the freeze you're referring to is communications. I know that there has also been a freeze related to the review of like NIH grants. So I think that sort of remains to be seen, since it's sort of rather unprecedented. But so far, these freezes don't impact appropriations specifically. So it's not impacting the federal funds flowing to our state.
So this one's for Hillary. How does a trust fund like the State Housing Trust Fund leverage 10 times what it has in community grant distribution? Thinking about how this might work out in like other trust fund structures like childcare.
Well, my mic won't turn on, so that's fun. I am not super familiar with the structure of other trusts, but DCA, most of its funding comes down from the federal level. So in the FY 2025 budget, for example, 68% of DCA's funding was federal funds. And so when I say that every $1 in the State Housing Trust Fund is leveraging over $10 in federal funds, it's because most of those grants are those federal funds that are being passed down through DCA and through the State Housing Trust Fund to those organizations that are addressing homelessness. So for example, I mentioned that statistic from FY 2023. In FY 2023, the State Housing Trust Fund had about $3 million, and they were leveraging $31 million in federal funds. So those federal funds were coming down through the State Housing Trust Fund and being distributed by DCA to those organizations on the ground addressing homelessness.
So, Leah, one way for the federal government to reduce Medicaid costs is to reduce the FMAP. Georgia's is 66%. If it were reduced to 55%, wouldn't that 10% difference need to be covered by the state with regard to now comp waivers?
Now comp waivers and anything else that gets a Medicaid match. So yeah, that is one of the proposals being discussed, is both reducing the match. So currently, for every dollar that we spend on healthcare for someone enrolled in Medicaid, the state pays 34 cents on the dollar, and the federal government pays 66 cents on the dollar. So they're really covering a majority of the cost for folks who are enrolled in Medicaid, at Peach Care, and enrolled in these other programs that get that federal match. So yes, any reduction in that federal match would then shift costs to the state, and we would have to make really difficult decisions about how to make up that cost, whether that be cuts in coverage or shifting other parts of the state budget. So yeah, it would be a really huge burden on our state budget.
Hillary, wanted to ask you, what else could the state fund to support housing?
So, I mean, the state could do a lot of different things. I mentioned that it could increase housing to the Georgia Housing Voucher Program and to the State Housing Trust Fund for the homeless. Another thing that housing advocates are looking at is for the state to create a permanent emergency rental, utility, and legal assistance program. The state received about, I believe, $1.3 billion during the pandemic for emergency rental assistance, and it used a portion of those funds to create a pilot state rental assistance program. So one thing that the state could do is invest funds to make that program permanent. Another thing that I've been looking at is the use of Medicaid funds for housing assistance and housing supports. That's something that a couple of other states have done, including North Carolina and Arizona. This past fall, actually, a couple of states used 1115 waivers to provide rental assistance up to 6 months for the first time. Another option is to use in lieu of services, which can provide housing, which allows managed care organizations to provide housing supports and other services like that that can be used in lieu of treating health conditions down the line. So for instance, maybe providing someone with a dehumidifier in their home instead of treating a respiratory condition that would be caused by unsafe housing conditions.
Thank you so much. We got this one working. Shout out to the AV team. I have a fun one for you, Leah. Okay, well, maybe this is nerdy fun. But what should be part of our public health infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, there's many things that could be part of the public health infrastructure, but I think there's three main buckets. Again, it's that well-trained, equitably paid, diverse, trusted public health workforce. We know that we are dealing with quite a bit of turnover because the pay in our state and local public workforce is not competitive. We also know that we need, I think we've learned through the pandemic that we need some modernization of our data systems and our technology systems in public health. We really need real-time, actionable data. And then I think a third sort of core tenet of that public health infrastructure is transparent, bidirectional communication with the public and the systems and processes that are needed to put that into place. So those are just three buckets of public health infrastructure that would go a long way towards building the foundation we need to address some of these really big public health problems we're facing, again, like suicide, opioid overdose, maternal mortality. We need that infrastructure in place in order to respond to those threats.
Great. So we're at the end of our question time, so I'll give y'all one final one for, I'm not even going to say a quick answer this time because I know how my colleagues are. Yes, yeah. When we leave this room today, what are 2 actions that we can take as advocates and community leaders to advance health justice?
Yes. Okay, so I love this question. Okay, so first, I want to say, in this sort of modern media environment, we know that it's really hard to break through, but peer-to-peer messaging can be so powerful, which means everyone in this room is an influencer. So if there's one thing I hope you take away from this, I hope that you will go home and you will tell your colleague, your friend, your neighbor, your fellow advocate about the importance of Medicaid. Just as one example, Medicaid covers more than half of Georgians' children. It makes it possible for kids in Georgia to go to the doctor, to fill their asthma prescription, to get their teeth cleaned. And right now, Medicaid is really facing one of its darkest hours. So we really need a groundswell of folks sort of shouting from the rooftops how important Medicaid is for Georgia and for our nation. So that would be one thing. Tell the people in your life about Medicaid, because I do think it's really a fairly misunderstood program. And then the other thing would be to participate in the public comment period for our Pathways to Coverage program. I'm sure all of us in this room believe that all Georgians deserve access to high-quality, affordable health care, and the state needs to hear from us as they are submitting for an extension for this current program, which currently is not getting us there. So you may not think you have a perspective to share if you're not a healthcare provider or a patient, but you do. If you have ever had, been a teacher, you've had a kid that was on Medicaid. You probably had a neighbor on Medicaid. You've probably had an older adult in your life that was paying for their long-term care through Medicaid. So really encourage everyone to either as an organization or an individual submit for public comment.
And I will echo Leah's plea for y'all to talk to everyone you know about these issues. I think with housing, I think everyone recognizes that housing affordability, like access to safe, stable, and affordable housing is a huge issue. What's difficult is getting people activated around it. So, I mean, like, tell your friends that session is going on. Get your friends plugged in with advocacy groups. For instance, House ATL does a lot of really awesome work. Follow along with what's going on. Contact your legislators. Tell them that you want more money for housing because we don't fund housing nearly enough. Yeah, just shout from the rooftops. Use your voice however you can. That's really, I think, the biggest thing that we can be doing right now.
Wonderful. Let's get a round of applause for our health team. As a reminder, we are rolling through this, but please feel free to take care of yourself. The restrooms are on either side of the registration table. So now we'll hear from our analysts covering education. So I'd like to invite Ife Finch-Floyd, our Director of Economic Justice, and Ashley Young, our Senior Education Analyst, to the stage. Ife will be covering the Department of Early Care and Learning, also known as DECAL, and Ashley will cover funding related to the Department of Education. I have the clicker. Do you want me to do it? Okay. Ashley, can you pass that? Ashley will cover funding related to the Department of Education, the Technical College System of Georgia, the University System of Georgia, and the Georgia Student Finance Commission. But we'll start with the budget for our youngest learners. So take it away, Ife.
All right. Okay, let me make sure. I need to make sure I know what I'm doing here. There we go. Okay. Thank you so much, Erin. Again, I am going to cover the Department of Early Care and Learning, or DECAL. Actually, let me back up just a second. That's a preview that I didn't want y'all to get to yet. So DECAL includes our CAPS program, that's Child Care and Parent Services program. It also includes the Georgia Pre-K program. It includes nutrition services like the Child and Adult Care Food Program and our Summer Meals Program. And finally, it includes quality initiatives, which make sure that our child care program is of high quality. Most of my remarks are going to focus on the general funds that support CAPS and also the lottery funds that support pre-K. All right. So, the governor is proposing $640 million for DECAL, and you can see how this breaks down. So there's about $77 million for the CAPS program, and about $563 million for our pre-K program. So this proposal would be about a 4% increase over the FY 2025 budget. So just going back really quickly to what's in the amended budget, we see $7.4 million to make sure that our pre-K teachers have pay parity with our K-12 teachers. So if you remember last year, our legislature invested almost $100 million in the pre-K system. That was one of the largest increase, or one of the largest increases that we've seen in a generation for our pre-K program. Really incredible investment. And one of the pieces that those resources are funding is to ensure that there's comparable pay between our pre-K teachers and our K through 12 teachers, because we have seen a lot of turnover for our pre-K teachers who have experienced very low wages for a while. This continues and builds upon that effort to make sure those pre-K teachers get the pay that they need and deserve. There's also another $100,000 to start up more summer meal sites this summer in the amended budget. Okay, so in the fiscal year budget for pre-K, we see an additional $22 million for the program. Again, this is building upon the progress that we saw last year, and this is really positive. So there's a $14 million increase for year 2 of a 4-year phase-in to reduce class sizes from 22 children in a class to 20 kids in a class. There's also another $5 million in the governor's budget to make sure we are updating and progressing with pre-K teacher training as well. Okay. So for childcare services, or for the CAPS program, the governor is proposing $5.5 million in additional funding. And we really need the legislature to do more than this, to really build upon this. So the governor is proposing $4 million for an additional 500 CAPS scholarships. So those are the childcare subsidies that help help families afford the cost of childcare. It also includes $1.5 million to increase to annualize the state match for CAPS reimbursements up to the 60th percentile of market rates. Last year, the legislature appropriated an additional $9.3 million to the CAPS program. And those resources are going to support that increased reimbursement. So this additional $1.5 million is to make sure that the state can continue to have that level of reimbursement. But I want to take a step back and look long-term at child care funding. Now, DECAL hasn't been around for this whole time, right, as an agency. I believe it started in the 2010s. But I have pulled together child care services funding from the different departments up to when DECAL was created, so going back to 2005. And what we see is that over the past generation, the state just simply has not invested in childcare. Since FY 2005, we only have spent 19% more than where we were in 20 years ago. And if you look at this timeline, in the 2010s, we also saw, we saw a dip in that funding because of, trying to conserve our resources towards the end of the Great Recession, and kind of still struggling to maintain or grow our state revenues at that point. But we also see some teachers leaving the profession at that point. And this is at a point where the kids who are most likely to need care, so those are kids who are under 13 and have all their parents in the workforce, so they're most likely to need care, those levels were either about the same or growing at that time. So the need was still there, and we still were not investing in what we needed. But I want to step back even further to also provide additional context about the child care system. Because the care of young children, as many women in here know, has been the domain of women, especially inside the household, right? But outside the household, in work, it's often expected that Black women were going to be the ones caring for our children, and that's been the expectation, certainly during enslavement and post-enslavement. And child care workers, along with other domestic workers, have often been left out of labor protections during the Social Security Act. In 1935, they were left out of the unemployment insurance. They were initially left out of the early Social Security program. And the federal government has often failed to make those critical investments in child care. And so what does that mean today, right? Mothers, in particular, are often the ones who struggle to work. They either don't work as much as they want to, they don't take that additional job, or they pull out of the workforce because they lack affordable or adequate care. And then quality care, right? The kind of child care that we really want our kids to be in is unaffordable for the typical family in most counties. And it's really unaffordable for Black families and Latinx families that tend to earn less. And really, the impact of this is the big impact on our economy. And Danny already mentioned this. A 2018 analysis by our friends at Gears and the Metro Atlanta Chamber
found that the economy loses about $1.75 billion annually because of childcare challenges, and we lose more than $100 million in tax revenues. And this, you can imagine, this has only grown over time. So this session, we really need lawmakers to do more to support childcare providers, families, and our economy. And so we have some recommendations. So first, we recommend to expand the CAPS scholarships to at least 72,000 slots. So the federal relief funding ended in September, but with that funding, we were able to boost those childcare subsidies from about 50,000 slots in a given week to 72,000 in a given week, a huge increase. But the state has had to begin to roll that back since that federal funding went away or unwinded. We also need to make sure that we are thinking about the providers and the teachers, the one who creates the supply for childcare, to make sure that they have what they need. And these are just two recommendations. I know there's some childcare advocates and in the audience, and they may have some other ideas as well. But end the regional variation on reimbursements to make sure there is equity across the state to support providers outside of the Atlanta metro area. Another idea is to make sure that childcare teachers and their kids are a part of a childcare priority group for access to childcare subsidies. So in Georgia, because we don't have a lot of resources for childcare subsidies, we have to have priority groups. Those priority groups include kids who are in foster care, kids who are very, very, very low income, who might receive TANF benefits, or if their family, if their parents are student parents. So those are the priority groups, and we're recommending to make childcare teachers one of those priority groups as well. All of this would require significant investment. So we are proposing appropriations of at least $20 million, but also, as Danny has teed up for me, to create a child care trust fund using the undesignated reserves, which would provide substantial long-term additional funding for the child care system. And I just want to note, we are not proposing to supplant appropriations with the trust fund, but to have them work together to provide the type of level of funding that we need for our child care system. So I'll pause there because I know my colleague Ashley has a lot of different departments that she needs to cover as well. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions later.
All right, way to go, Ife. Thank you for that. Good morning again, and welcome to the education section. If you can hear my voice, clap once. All right, y'all remember. We're all my educators in the house. Any teachers, former educators? All right, we got to stick together, yes? Awesome. Again, my name is Ashley Young, and I'm the Senior Education Policy Analyst here at GBPI. And as I was starting to get my remarks together, I remember on the spot I gave this quote last year, and I was like, well, I'm going to do it again this year. I guess it's just because it's a good place to really set the tone. One of my favorite intellectuals, her name is Dr. Bettina Love. Yes. And she says, abolitionist educators fight for children they will never meet or see because they are visionaries. That is what I seek to do. I know a lot of the work that you all are doing is certainly in this category as well, and so I just want to start there. I'm going to be covering a few departments today, or a few agencies, and I'm going to start with the Georgia Department of Education. I recently acquired the K-12 education portfolio, so I will start here. With the Quality Basic Education Act program, keep in mind this is our formula, which provides our formula for funding schools, based on full-time equivalent students for the instructions of students through K-12. Danny, our legislative director, spoke a little bit about this earlier, but what I want to do is give you a little bit of information for amended fiscal year, some changes that we are seeing. So I'm going to start with the $114 million increase for the midterm enrollment growth. Next, you will see $12 million to increase for the state commission charter school, and this is specifically for competitive grants, planning, implementation, facilities, and operations. We see a $12 million change for amended fiscal year 25 to increase the special needs scholarship and voucher. And this is one of 3 vouchers in Georgia. So students who have an individualized education plan or IEP or 504 plan are eligible for this scholarship. And just a little bit of background information on this annual scholarship last year, the range was between $1,500 to $15,000 for the awards. Next, we have the security grants. So this year in amended fiscal year, there's about a $50 million increase for one-time funds for additional school security grants. That shakes out to only about $21,000 per school system, so not a ton, but again, this is just in addition to the $158 million total budget. Another notable change here is a $95,000 increase for the technology, career, and education, specifically the Great Promise Partnership Operation. So this program is essentially designed to equip students with academic, vocational, and technical training and leadership skills. And in the proposed amended fiscal budget 25, again, it includes $95,000, and that goes to fund 2 full-time and 2 part-time positions and operating costs to sustain this program at the Department of Education. All right, and one thing I want to point out here as we are thinking through how this overall sort of policy landscape in K-12 sort of fits in, I want you all to take a quick look here. You'll probably hear me say the word disinvestment a lot because unfortunately that's a lot of the trends that we're seeing in these particular policy areas. But the teacher base salaries, they continue to lag behind the cost of living. So inflation is a major challenge. We do a superintendent survey every year, and as I was coding and analyzing the data, that was certainly something that we were seeing, the issues with inflation. One thing I want to point out here, that if Georgia were meeting the demand of inflation in 2024, for starting teachers, for the starting base salary rather, teachers would receive on average $7,900 more annually. That breaks down to about $395 per pay period, and that's major for teachers. I want to point out that in addition, Georgia is 39th in the nation for starting salaries, and we are 20th overall average in the nation. So when we think about all of the challenges that are stacked against us in Georgia, Danny referenced this earlier, I'll talk more about our opportunity weight. These are many of the financial challenges that we are having. We must pay our teachers more because, again, this is lagging behind inflation and so many other things that are that are challenging to our teachers that they are having to tackle. I'm going to point out a little bit about pupil transportation here. So we can also see in this graph how state funding is not keeping up with the total cost. Now, we did have some significant changes and increases in our pupil transportation in the budget last year. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But again, there is so much more work to do. So as you can see, that top line there is the actual total cost for buses and for pupil transportation. And about 55% of our students in K-12 around the state are actually riding the bus. We know this has a lot of implications for absenteeism, which has been an issue in education, particularly after the pandemic. And so these are the areas in which we come in and think about the infrastructure of funding. We must invest in our pupil transportation. A few other programs I want to point out here for you all today, and this starts our fiscal year proposed 2026 budget. Communities and schools, these are amazing programs that are necessary for students, and this is a way for them to partner with schools and other organizations, and this is really aiding with student success and additional support for students, but unfortunately we are seeing a one-time decrease. As we think about the high teacher ratios, students to teacher ratios, and high students to counselor ratios, we need as much support that we can get from programs like Communities in Schools, but unfortunately we see a $1 million decrease. I'm going to point out here the Georgia Promise Scholarship. A lot of you all know this as a school voucher. Senate Bill 233, which was just recently passed in our last legislative session. And so this will provide up to $6,500 in school voucher assistance and will take effect in the 25 to 26 school year, so this upcoming school year. Students can use this for tuition, tutoring, textbooks, that sort of thing. The initial proposed asked amount is $141 million, so this is about 1% of QBE, which is written into the bill. And so right now, as it stands, students who are attending the lowest performing schools, the 25% lowest performing schools, can be eligible to apply. However, in December, if you all were sort of following what was going on with student vouchers, we have now learned that the Georgia Education Saving Authorities, who actually created the law and writes the rules, are actually saying that students who live in the attendance zones could be eligible even if they don't attend the school. So what does that mean? More students could be eligible for student vouchers, and this is not the direction we want to go in if we are really looking to equitably fund K-12 education as a whole. As we know, like I mentioned, 1% is capped for funding formula for the Georgia Promise Scholarship, so it could be up to $144 million. That could provide around 22,000 vouchers. But currently, Georgia has about 1.5 million public school students, and in an analysis by the Associated Press, finds that more than 400,000 students could get a chance to apply. This means this could really put pressure on legislators to expand this program. We're already seeing that pressure from the federal policy landscape, and so this could really expand in the next coming years. But for right now, it is around $141 million. And I want to add here that additional funding for students in poverty, this is a bit unconventional. I generally wouldn't add this, but I want to kind of juxtapose this. So again, we are one of 6 states that does not provide what we refer to as an opportunity weight or poverty weight to provide additional funding for students who are, one, impoverished, or for districts who serve majority of their students who are impoverished. So this is a really serious challenge, and I have a chart here that kind of gives you an understanding. This is just through year 5, just how much money could be diverted from public schools to voucher programs. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about higher education. I will cover the University System of Georgia, the Technical College System of Georgia, and Georgia Student Finance Commission. Before I get started, I just want to give you a quick overview of what this will look like in the proposed 2026 state investment in higher education. So we have about $3.6 billion for the University System of Georgia, which is our 4-year public colleges. There's 26 of those institutions. Our technical college system, which is about $538 million, and there are 22 of those institutions. And then our Georgia Student Finance Commission, Think Hope Scholarship, Hope Grants. So for the Board of Regents in the amended fiscal year, some of the notable changes that I want to point out to you are the student teaching and learning. So this is really a lot of the part of the budget that we focus on here at GBPI. So we have about a $17 million increase, and this is specifically for a cost of living adjustment. Cooperative extension, so to increase for the FY 2025 employer share of benefits. So you'll hear me talk a lot about that with each of these agencies, and so that total is $468,000, and the total AFY amended fiscal year, 2025 for the University System of Georgia is around $18 million. Now for the proposed fiscal year 2026 in the USG teaching and learning, we see about $170 million for enrollment and square footage. The higher education formula for the University System of Georgia incorporates these two factors, so based on enrollment, and it's generally like a 2-year lag, but based on enrollment and based on square footage, these calculations go into a formula to determine how much each college will be receiving. There will be a $118 million proposal, or is a proposal for capital projects at various institutions. So this is for facilities and operations around campus, and $11 million for the teachers' retirement system, employer contribution, and $19 million for increased funds for the employment share of health benefits. All right. USG Public Libraries, there's going to be a notable change here, a couple notable changes, $1.8 million in increased funds for employer share of health benefits. And then another notable change that I want to point out here is the increase again for the TRS employer contribution of $261,000. This kind of ties a little bit into our health justice, but I wanted to share with you all that there's an unfortunate decrease with the Medical College of Georgia Hospital and Clinics, the MCG 3 program. There is a shortage of doctors in Georgia, and not just a shortage, but certainly in rural areas. I'm a rural girl, so I know all about it. This is so important, and unfortunately, there's an $8 million decrease, the endowment from a program endowment, and this budget is now at $37 million. So the total state general funds for AFY 25, again, is $3.4 billion, and fiscal year 2026 is $3.6 billion. Now for the Technical College System of Georgia, I will cover 3 areas here. As you can see, adult education, technical education, and the high-cost programs and special projects. So we have here for adult education, $58 million proposed FY 2026. Again, we see the increase in TRS employer contribution here for a total of $10,000. And then for technical education, we see a $25 million increase for a total of $969 million. And a TRS employer contribution increase for $331,000, and a 10.6% increase in enrollment, and a decrease in square footage. So keep in mind, the formula focuses on enrollment. It also focuses on square footage, and when you have an increase or decrease, that will play into, that will help determine how much money is allotted. Next, the proposed FY 2026 for technical education. This is really based on a lot of our high demand career fields. So $24 million for total increase, $16 million for growth in aviation, commercial truck driving and nursing program enrollment, and then also an $8 million transfer of funds from technical education to actually fully fund these high cost programs. As you can see, the total general funds for amended fiscal year for Technical College System of Georgia is $489 million, and the total cost for fiscal year 2026 is $538 million. I did want to point out that Technical College System of Georgia is seeing an uptick in enrollment, and this is a really good thing. TCSG struggled a lot after the Great Recession. They struggled some after the pandemic, but they have surely picked back up. As you can see, 21 out of 22 of the TSG institutions have experienced growth in enrollment. All right, now let's talk a little bit about Georgia Student Finance Commission. I want to first point out here, the following programs saw no change, so they remain flat. College completion grants remains at $10 million. If you remember, about 3 years ago, this bill passed, House Bill 1435, I think it was, passed to allow emergency funding for students who were at least 80% complete towards their credentials to be able to qualify for up to $2,500 throughout their college career. Again, we saw no change in that. That remains flat at $10 million. For the Reach Georgia Scholarship, that also remains flat at 6.3 million students from around the state in certain areas can apply as a rising 8th grader. This is a mentoring scholarship program and could potentially, once they graduate, receive up to $10,000 with the Reach Scholarship. So that has remained flat at 6.3 million. Tuition equalization grants, remain at $24 million. These are funds that help students who are attending any private schools here in Georgia. They can receive funds through tuition equalization grants. That remains at $25 million. And then the IPSE, also known as the Inclusive Post-Secondary Education, has remained flat. And this is essentially for students with intellectual or developmental disabilities who attend an IPSE program at a university here would be able to receive these grants. But again, that has remained flat. Now for Hope Scholarship, you see for public schools, they received a $60 million increase. And just to be clear, this was a decrease all in this section last year, but there is an increase of $60 million in a total of $905 million. And then with private schools, we see a $3 million increase to about $78 million. And then Hope grants for TCSG institutions is a $17 million increase to total $93 million. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Education Lottery Fund. And if you know anything about our research here at GBPI, we talk a lot about what we can do with our surplus. So what I want to really point out here is that the education lottery is essentially for two sort of levels of education, pre-K, to fund pre-K, and to also fund higher education scholarships. And so right now, the education lottery totals a $2.2 billion reserve, and the Hope Reserve, so essentially 50% of last year's proceeds must be held on to ensure that we have enough money for the Hope Scholarship. We are $1.4 billion more than what should be in the bank. Okay, so when we think about this, I don't know about you all, but I get a little frustrated. I get a little infuriated. I remember my very first time, it was in this building in 2020 when I came as a guest of GBPI, and I heard my predecessor, Jennifer Lee, give this stat. I could have burst into flames. I started thinking about students. My mind started going back to the summer melt conversations, and all I could think about is, let's be clear, we have this much money in our education lottery reserve, and we have students who are not going to college or who believe they can't attend college. If you're anything like me, this does not sit well with you. This also should not sit well with you. We need an education lottery funds to fund a comprehensive need-based aid. Why? Georgia is third in the nation for student loan debt per borrower, behind Washington, D.C. and Maryland, respectively. I once had to say this stat in the state of Maryland. I wasn't ready for that. And so what I want to really drive home here, folks, when we start thinking about these barriers, we have almost 50% of our undergraduate students who are Pell eligible. We have, as I just mentioned, over $1 billion in our undesignated lottery education fund, and we are third in the nation for student loan debt per borrower. With the merit-based scholarship policy infrastructure that we are currently in here in Georgia, we are finding that not only is it not equitable, it's not sufficient, okay? So there are many changes that can be made. I have about 1 minute left, and I really want to address this before I take a seat here. This is why equitable funding matters in higher education. The total undergraduate student loan amount. Let's be clear, I'm gonna talk about and raise up for students who are racially marginalized, but I also just want to show this is affecting students from all different backgrounds. Do you all see this? So what I will point out here, though, is Black or African American students represent 44% of the students, almost 50% of the students with student loan debt, but they only represent 29% of students in the University System of Georgia. So not even a third representation in terms of student body, but make up almost 50% for student loan debt per borrower. This is challenging to look at when we think about all of the money that's sitting in our education lottery reserve, when we think about the challenges that we have here in higher education. I'm gonna stop here. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm gonna turn it back over to Erin to get us going with questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. So we'll start with a question for Ife. If Georgia increases caps to accommodate 72,000 slots, approximately how many slots would we be short to support the remaining amount of children that require care?
Okay, thank you so much for the question, Erin. So the short answer is I don't know, but I wanted to I wanted to offer some facts to kind of help us think about where we stand and really what the need is. So in order to kind of begin to reduce our level of back down to about 50,000 kids served with CAPS from that 72,000 level, DeCal has made a few changes to try to do that. So first, one of the things that it's done to its priority group, which includes a very low income priority group, you now have to meet that priority group, you have to be 10% of the federal poverty line. I don't even know if you know how little money that is, but very little money. And it's the priority groups, again, that are the ones who are most likely going to get those CAPS slots. And then if you're not a part of the priority group, you have to be of 30% of state median income. And we've reduced that down. We used to be at 50% for our eligibility. So I think we have to think about the analysis of, how many, in order to understand that number, right? What's the gap between the 72 and the need? We would need to understand how many kids have parents or caregivers in the labor market who need care, right? So I haven't done that analysis, but I wanted to begin to offer like what the eligibility is looking like, and what we have done is contract because we are trying to reduce how many kids we're serving because we don't have those resources. But in reality, right, it is not, certainly people with low income, families with low income certainly need support with childcare. But when we looked at the typical family income, the median family income across the state in actually 159 counties, we found that childcare was unaffordable in 142 of the counties, so the majority of the counties for the typical family. So the federal government says that for childcare to be affordable, it has to be 7% of median income. And that means in 140 counties for infants and for toddlers, especially because those are the most expensive children to care for, it is more than that. So we can certainly think about supporting, prioritizing families with the lowest levels of income, but even when you get to moderate levels of income and middle income folks, they're also needing support affording the cost of care. And I think there's different ways to think about how to support them, like through expanding and enhancing the child and dependent care credits and things like that. So I just wanted to note that it is a complicated answer, but we also have a complicated eligibility system and a set of complicated needs.
Thank you so much. So this next question is for Ashley, and I'm kind of going to combine two. So you mentioned the establishment of the Georgia Promise Scholarship or school voucher as an antithesis to investing equitably in education. Can you explain why this issue is so critical in a state like Georgia, which is one of only a handful of states that does not provide additional funding to students in poverty? And while you're answering that, can you also tell us whether or not the voucher, like for example, for low-income students, whether or not you feel like it's helpful or it could be harmful?
All right, that sounds like a bit of an opinion question, but I'm actually going to include some data background, of course. But to answer the first part of your question, I read a really important report by the Economic Policy Institute just recently by Hillary Weething, I believe is how you pronounce her name. But one of the things that she helped me understand is that as we are taking money out of our public schools for school vouchers, because of course the enrollment is going down, and when enrollment goes down, funding goes down at the particular school, what we also find is there are fixed costs. So what happens is if you have, say, 50 students less now because of the public school vouchers, you're not going to cut off a few classrooms and save on utilities and air and heating, right? Does that make sense? So you already have these fixed costs that aren't going anywhere for years. typically right after, this enrollment decline. So with these fixed cost school districts are still responsible to pay for these high costs, even though they have fewer students and they're receiving less money. And so I think that that's one main reason, and it helped me sort of open my mind up to some other ways to think about this issue. And then the next part is here at GBPI, so as you can imagine, we are lobbying and advocating for every single Georgian, right? We don't have any particular special interest with any groups. We want everyone in this room, your family, your friends here in Georgia, to be able to not only survive but thrive. And so as a result of that, we do not see school vouchers as a direction to go in, because this is not a comprehensive infrastructure understanding of how to gain equitable funding in public schools. I don't know about you, there was a movie that came out not too long ago about this woman getting a school voucher for her child, and at the time when I wasn't as much of a critical thinker, I thought, wow, this is great. She's got money to send her kid to a private school, my goodness. But now that I am a little bit wiser, I understand that we need to be investing comprehensively into an opportunity way, a poverty way, to ensure that all students have access to a quality education.
Thank you, Ashley. We're getting to the end of our questions for this period, so I'll ask one more to Ife. And as a reminder, if you did not get your question answered, we will be sharing answers via email. But a quick I'm going to stop saying that. Ife, support for the early child care sector, specifically where there have been decades of disinvestments, has not been great. So there's been disinvestments in educator pay that have not been on par with K-12 pay. Do you have any ideas to support early child care sector workers, particularly their health care as well? Or have you heard anything?
So first, I think that comes with, actually, let me back up. And I'll try to say this quickly. And I was chatting with somebody that I was going to mention it, and I'm going to mention it. So you may have heard that childcare is a market failure. And that is because we cannot increase supply when demand goes up as readily as we can in other spaces, right? If we need more slots, that means you need to bring in more teachers. But because pay is so low, that means you have to increase the pay to bring in more teachers. But what does that do? That means it increased the cost for childcare, and that might lower demand because childcare is already quite expensive. So it does not operate on a typical supply, or typical is not typical, but on this idea of, supply and demand. That means you need government intervention when you have circumstances like that. So in part, we need to be able to support providers to making sure that they can invest in their staff as well. Providers often operate on shoestring budgets. They do not rake in, a lot of profits, and therefore they can't invest in their staff the way they need to. If we were to think about something like a child care trust fund, if we invest $1.5 billion in the trust fund, GBPI analysis finds that with a 6% payout, we would have $97 million just in the first year, and of the trust fund, and about $1 billion in the first 10 years. That is a type of level of investment that we need to be talking about, but it's hard to talk about that level of investment when we're talking about it in the context of appropriations. But if you think about it, if we're able to support providers through reimbursements and other supports, they can begin to invest in their staff and increase pay and increase benefits as well.
Thank you so much. So Ife's going to stay here. Ife's going to stay here. Thank you so much, Ashley. And so now we're moving to our final fireside chat with our economic justice team. So I also like to welcome Ray Calfani, our senior analyst for worker justice and criminal legal systems. Ray will start us off with some overviews from the Georgia Department of Labor and the Georgia Department of Corrections, followed by Ife's overview for the Department of Human Services. Let's get started.
Thank you, Aaron. What you say? You can click, please. Well, you know what? I'll do it. I think I got it. Let me make sure. Here we go. Okay. Greetings again, everyone. I'm Ray Califani, Senior Analyst for Workers' Justice and Criminal Legal System at GPI. Sorry. Today I'm going to highlight the spending for two budgets. That's the Department of Labor and the Department of Corrections. And I'll say, we often say in terms of budgets that budgets are moral documents that talk about, what we care about. And I'll take it a step further and say that, the way that our budget documents are written determines, what we want the public to see and how easily we want them to see it. And that leads me to start with the Department of Labor, which is tasked with maintaining a resilient UI system that protects involuntarily jobless workers as they transition back into the workforce, which is a very critical part of what they do in terms of maintaining economic stability during recessions. And the Department of Labor is also tasked with generating revenue that helps support the state's general fund, as well as sustaining their own administrative operations, as well as maintaining the solvency of our unemployment insurance benefit trust fund. Now, before I get into numbers, I want to give it a little context of how we got here, in terms of where we are in the Department of Labor's budget. And I'll start by saying that last year, the Georgia Department of Labor began utilizing funding, to pursue what they phrase as the largest modernization of their UI system in Georgia's history. And we should view any successful modernization of our UI system as an ongoing process that requires sustained investment from federal funding and state funding. At the same time, while ensuring that the Department of Labor maintains the highest standards of operations so that they're still serving the public the way they should, even while modernizations take place. Now, going into my first slide, before I even talk about what all this means, I want to just give a little more context to say that during last year's legislative session, our late and former Department of Labor Commissioner Bruce Thompson requested $18 million in state funding to support these modernization efforts. Now, however, what happened is that what passed out of the legislature and what was signed by the governor was a state funding level for our modernization for our Department of Labor, and only $9 million. So, and this is essentially the same state funding level for our Department of Labor that's been for the last few fiscal years, before this current year that we're still in, fiscal year 2025, which I'm talking about. And so, but the only difference in fiscal year 2025 is just a shifting of these existing dollars, where you're shifting program funds to redirect that towards the modernization of our unemployment insurance system. Now, this here is just talking about what was done in our, amended fiscal year of 2024, our last amended fiscal year, and what we're still currently in fiscal year 2025. This is just ultimately showing that this is just a redirection of existing funding, not, basically, there's no new funding or very little new funding that's come to the Department of Labor to be able to support this large-scale modernization that we have. Now, going into the next slide, and just talking about where we are right now, and we're still in fiscal year 2025, and the type of changes that are coming. You see, this is not very much here on this slide, because there are not very many changes that took place in terms of the Department of Labor's budget, in terms of state funding. For amended changes to fiscal year 2025, there's no changes to the Department of Labor. For fiscal year 2026, which is the next fiscal year that comes after what we're in right now, the totality of that is an $11,000 reduction in state funding. This is basically going towards adjustments for insurance programs that protect the Department of Labor, and just adjustments in terms of billing operations, right? So now just thinking about what does all this mean? What's the impact that's there when we're talking about these very minor changes that are taking place? So modernizing Georgia's unemployment insurance system, is based on these current priorities that we're talking about so far, has meant very limited state investment. and primarily just a shifting, as I mentioned, of these long-established state funding levels to support modernization. And it also suggests that the funding priorities from the Department of Labor's agency leaders are widely different from the funding priorities of state lawmakers. And it also suggests that there could be major state funding opportunities that are being left off the table when we're thinking about modernizing our unemployment insurance system. Everybody remembers how ugly it was during the pandemic, how many people, lawmakers, affected, workers were just shouting to the mountaintops about how we don't have an agency that's prepared to be able to handle a recession, certainly not one as big as a pandemic. And honestly, these budget priorities around the Department of Labor create more questions than they do answers. For one, is this modernization effort that we're in right now under this current state funding approach, is it as robust as it should be, right? And, can we, and more specifically, can we balance the needs of unemployed workers who need more access into our unemployment insurance system with the needs of our Department of Labor to have a more streamlined, flexible and adaptable system that also minimizes, the occurrence of overpayments or other forms of improper payments of UI benefits. The other question we think about is, are we sacrificing some of the Department of Labor's current capacity to be able to, to serve unemployed workers, to support these modernization efforts that, the Department of Labor itself is projected won't even be completed until 2026. And I say that when I say about, this current capacity, there's still data that shows, like unemployment insurance performance data that shows that the Georgia Department of Labor is still underperforming when it comes to timely processing of benefits. And then third, if this funding is not enough to support a robust modernization process, should we be looking at tapping into some of the other revenue streams that the Department of Labor generates, particularly, and I mean, when I say that, I'm talking about specifically what's called administrative assessment fee revenue. That's part of what employers pay in their contributions to support our unemployment insurance system. Can we tap into that? Just to give a few numbers, in fiscal year 2023, there's the state revenue books list about $100 million that's been generated by the Georgia Department of Labor in administrative assessment fee revenue. And just dating back to 2016, every year there's been an average of $20 million that's been generated by administrative assessment fees by the Department of Labor. So you're talking about a $9 million, state lawmakers have agreed to a $9 million state budget for the Department of Labor, but they're generating an average of $20+ million a year in administrative assessment fee revenue alone, which it's going back and forth in terms of how that money should be utilized to support whether it's our general fund or the Department of Labor who's actually generating that revenue. So going into my next slide, my last slide about the Department of Labor, is just some of the data that is relevant to the modernization that's taking place. For one, black workers in Georgia have a lot of skin in the game. For as long as we can remember, black Georgians' unemployment likelihoods are certainly much higher overall. They've consistently doubled that of the likelihood that white workers have in terms of unemployment. And even what's been found a couple of years ago, that black workers in Georgia are disproportionately denied unemployment insurance. For those who still are able to be enrolled in unemployment insurance, black workers are overrepresented in our UI rolls. As you see, 62% of those who were on UI in December were black workers. Also, just thinking about, I talked about administrative assessment revenue already, and thinking about just beyond the general funds that supply our Department of Labor, there was $115 million exactly, or very close to that. That was, part of fiscal year 2023 generation in terms of administrative assessment revenue, $14 million in fiscal year 2024. Where's this money going? And just thinking about just the state of our trust fund. A lot of people who may think about our unemployment insurance trust fund, is it solvent or not? Where is it at? Is it healthy? As of the beginning of this year, our trust fund had about $1.87 billion in it. That is still far below what the federal government recommends, which is about $3.2 billion. To put that in to a better perspective, when we had about 1.6 billion at the start of 2024. That was enough to cover about 5 months of the average recession in Georgia, right? So 1.87 billion, I don't know, that might cover maybe 6, right? In terms of the average recession that we have in Georgia, we've got enough right now to possibly cover maybe 6 months of a recession. Now I'm going to just breeze through. I'm going to take it over to the Department of Corrections. Well, I'll say, before I do that, I just want to also say, when we think about modernization, we also want to make sure that we're not creating a system, we're not modernizing a system that's going to be over-calibrated to falsely accuse people of unemployment insurance fraud, right? Because that's something that just can just layer on top of the terrible, criminal legal system that we already have that criminalizes so many Georgians for just some of the most ridiculous reasons. So, and that I'll transition into Department of Corrections and just go through numbers here. Minute fiscal year 2025, there was quite a bit of revenue that's being generated. I think that the numbers that really matter is, we hear a lot, we've seen in the news about this massive reform of our prison system. I wouldn't call it that. I would call it a lot more money that's being poured into our prison system compared to, the previous fiscal year or previous fiscal years before that. And they're being given to a lot of the same things that they've been given to in terms of infrastructure, salary increases for, prison staff. Granted, there's been increases in terms of, expanding prison health contracts, as well as recent increases in our technical college and vocational education contracts for incarcerated Georgians. And this is for amended fiscal year 2025, which is about a total of about $359 million being added to our fiscal year 2025 budget for prisons. And that is about 4 times what was added during this same time in the amended fiscal year 2024's budget. So a lot more money is being added, in terms of the amended spending that's being added to our fiscal year 2025 budget compared to fiscal year 2024. So that is certainly significant. Just thinking about, across sub-agency within the correction system, state prison sub-agency within our Department of Corrections is getting the majority of these additions in spending, and much of that is going to, adding these mobile units, what they call modular units for some incarcerated Georgians to be housed in while they're doing upgrades to other parts of prison facilities, adding 300 positions for correctional officers, funding efforts in terms of, HVAC, plumbing and electrical needs that we know are, and for folks who are directly impacted or those who support loved ones there know are really, really bad. And there's a lot of folks that never have air conditioning and never have heat. They have always had issues in terms of plumbing or electrical issues. And then adding for security, upgrades for 1,400 body cameras and over 1,300 tasers to boost security. Fiscal year 2026, not as much of an increase in our prison budget, but still quite a bit. About a total of $125 million being added for fiscal year 2026 for pretty much of the same things, increases in infrastructure, capital, security, project management improvements, 31 million to continue to expand prison healthcare contracts, added 22 million to go to correction staff salary increases and new promotional systems. And then just continue funds to be able to expand technical and vocational education contracts in our state prisons. And the state prison sub-agency within the Department of Corrections, again, they've gotten the majority of this increased proposed funding. That includes a 4% salary increase for all correctional officers, an 8% salary increase for other behavioral health and maintenance staff, chaplains at our state prisons, and then going towards just a new promotional system for correctional officers. So with all that said, in terms of what this means, I'll go back to what I mentioned in terms of there's been things said about there's this large-scale reform of our prison system. No, there's just a much higher increase in spending towards many of the same things that we've been spending in terms of our prison system. granted, when you look at it more granularly in terms of, okay, they're doing more to fix certain locks inside of our prison system. They're adding these mobile units, or these smaller things. When you want to look at granularly, okay, that can be different than a previous budget proposal that we've had. But all in all, it's just more money going into infrastructure, more money going into staff salary increases, and more money in terms of prison spending. But what's not addressed in this prison budget, and what hasn't been addressed in any of these prison budgets that we've had in Georgia, are we've got an expansion of the presence of healthcare providers in terms of these contracts for mental health, physical health, pharmacy, and dental. But at the same time, the barriers that keep people from being able to access healthcare often, which are healthcare, getting the name of it already, but the copay, healthcare copays. That's pretty much the barrier that decided whether someone can get the health care they need in prison or not. There's nothing in this budget that addresses the financial barriers of healthcare copays. For those who were, many of those who were very much coerced into providing their labor for free in prisons, there's nothing about how they are able to afford, these basic necessities when they get paid nothing for what they do, or very little. And then for those who are in transitional centers, who, they may get, minimal pay on the outside in a civilian job. The majority of that pay still goes to the prison system, and they're even expected to get outside health care. They get nothing from these healthcare contracts that are being expanded. So with that said, I'll stop there. As we started going to questions, I've probably gone pretty long, so I'll turn it into our question time. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll give it over to you, my apologies.
I'm so glad to be back up here because I was shivering. I was really trying hard to hide it. But now I'm up here, I'm getting warm, so it's gonna be great and it's gonna be okay. I hope you guys are warm and caffeinated and all that jazz. All right, I'm gonna bring it home, okay? So I'm gonna start with the federal landscape. Because I know, again, as my colleagues have already said, that's top of mind for a lot of folks. So in the Department of Human Services, 55% of that budget as a whole is federal funds, and that includes resources from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which helps provide some dollars for the administration of that program. It also includes some block grants, like the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families block grant, which provides cash assistance to families with children who are very, 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 very low income, and also the Social Services block grant, which supports the child welfare system. These three programs and block grants that I named have been in unofficial, I'll say at the moment, proposals for cuts, right? But we don't know what that's going to look like yet, so it's really hard to offer more concrete details about what the impact will be on the state. But just know that, again, I think Danny mentioned this earlier, that federal resources are really critical to DHS's budget. The other piece I want to name, I don't typically talk about SNAP in these budget overviews when I've done them in the past, and that's because it's largely funded with federal dollars. But I want to be very clear about SNAP's impact on Georgia. So again, SNAP provides food stamps to 1.4 million, actually it's not food stamps anymore, it's an EBT card, they've modernized a little bit, 1.4 million Georgians. It helps them afford the growing cost of food, right? And my colleague Hillary mentioned when people have expensive, have other expenses that might challenge them being able to maintain their housing. If somebody were to lose their food stamps, for example, that may challenge them to afford their prescriptions or, again, make sure that they are paying their full rent, right? So food stamps is incredibly, incredibly important. Also, food stamps are federally funded 100%. The actual benefit is 100% federally funded, right? The administration is shared 50-50 with the state and the feds, but the benefits, SNAP benefits, are 100% federally funded. And $3 billion came into Georgia in Fed fiscal year 2023. And when we look at the regions of the state that utilize SNAP the most, it tends to be the more rural regions and small towns as opposed to the more metropolitan areas. So those SNAP benefits are really supporting local economies. And if those were to decline dramatically, that could really mean that one grocery store is gonna close. Okay, so if we're talking about public health, if we're talking about economic security, SNAP is a cornerstone of that. And I just want to be very clear, and I will renew my colleagues' calls of keeping that in mind if you are engaging with decision makers at the federal level. All right, get off of that soapbox for now. Let's go now to the state funding of our Department of Human Services. So we have a relatively flat funding for this, the governor proposed relatively flat funding for fiscal year 2026. That's about 0.1% decline, so a slight decline, but more or less flat funding. So in the amended fiscal year 25 proposal, the biggest line item that I'm gonna just name is a one-time funding of $5.8 million in child support, and that is around technology, making sure their software is, applications are a part of the Georgia Technology Authority mainframe. But the other piece I want to point you to, my colleague Leah teed this up a little bit, an additional $1.5 million here to continue to integrate pathways into the Georgia eligibility system, but also to integrate Georgia Access into the Georgia Gateway eligibility system. So for the federal, said the same thing again, sorry y'all, had my tea, I swear. For fiscal year 2026, the proposed changes, I tried to categorize them in different ways. There's no major shift in any one department, right? Not a big change in adjustment here. There's more kind of small marginal changes, and they fall into generally these categories. So funding adjustments due to actions at the federal level, funding adjustments due to lower collections on certain fines and fees, and also transfers. So funding adjustments due to actions on the federal level, for example, a $1.5 million cut in child welfare to eliminate the matching funds because the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services decided not to fund a wraparound service pilot called Unite Us, right? So again, those federal actions caused the state to reduce its funding. Looking at funding cuts due to lower collections, a $120,000 cut to the Safe Harbor for Sexually Exploited Children Fund Commission to reflect lower FY 2024 collections of financial penalties for sex trafficking and sexual offenses and adult entertainment establishment assessments. So for transfers, again, a cut of $225,000 in elder community and living services due to transferring the brain health awareness program to public health. So again, marginal around the edges changes for relatively stable funding for the Department of Human Services. DHS includes a lot of different programs. This pie chart consolidates a lot of them, but if you wanted to look at what's included in those different wedges of the pie, I have that table to the right. But what you can see, the biggest takeaway here is that 62% of DHS's budget is from foster care and adoptions and child welfare services. That's the majority of the budget here. While there's only 16% for low-income services, and again, that includes supports like food assistance, cash assistance, refugee assistance, and other programs like that. However, I would argue that the state is probably paying more to react to families already experiencing instability and possible crises, as opposed to investing more in prevention strategies to reduce involvement with the child welfare system as a whole. And that's because there is growing evidence that that expanding access to income supports actually reduce child maltreatment costs. The lack of critical economic supports can increase the likelihood of child welfare involvement. So when legislators are thinking about the DHS budget this year, we would encourage them to move upstream, to think about the needs before a family hits a crisis and all of a sudden comes to the attention of the child welfare system. So legislators should, these are just two recommendations that align with our policy priorities, but I'm sure everyone in this room can come up with even more recommendations in addition to this. But first, it would be to increase the pay of DFACS eligibility workers. So last year, there was a $3,000, in addition to a COLA that most state workers, almost all state workers got, other frontline workers in the Department of Human Services got an additional $3,000 pay increase. But DFACS eligibility workers did not. Those are the eligibility workers that help people access public benefits like SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, child care, because those eligibility operations live in DHS. And because we've long had a workforce shortage of eligibility workers, it makes it harder and more complicated for them to access those benefits. So those DFACS eligibility workers were left out of that $3,000 pay increase. We are recommending for them to get that $3,000 pay increase, if not more, right? Because what we need is a competent and stable workforce. This workforce has tended to have a lot of turnover. Oh, hello. Okay. This workforce has tended to have a lot of turnover, and the turnover is still quite high. It's higher than when it was pre-pandemic. And the turnover tends to happen. We've had a lot of hiring recently because of Medicaid unwinding. However, where we see the most turnover for this workforce are among the people who were hired in the past year. So those folks who were just hired, right, are leaving because they're high caseloads. Caseloads are about at like 600 per worker, and the pay is still relatively low, right? The second piece that we would recommend would be to expand eligibility, increase benefits for temporary assistance for needy families. So TANF changed from an eligibility entitlement program in the mid-1990s. And it really hasn't been updated since. So for a family of 3, the benefit is still $280 a month. I don't know what y'all can do with that. I can't do with it. That's basically like my groceries for a week. I don't know about you guys, but it's nothing for anybody, right? And you have to be almost destitute to actually get the program. So in 2023, the governor had a bill that did some modest and welcome changes. For example, allowing pregnant women without children to access TANF, and also getting rid of what's called the TANF family cap. So that means if you are already on the TANF program with kids and you have another child, well, the cap did so you can't get an additional incremental increase, right? We eliminated that. That's fantastic. But let's go back to those pregnant women. The eligibility limit for a family of 1 is around $400-ish. So if you are working even a little bit and you are a pregnant person and you need additional support to prepare for your baby, you can't even get it. So our recommendation is to think about expanding eligibility in a number of different ways and making sure those benefits are meaningful. So I'm going to pause there. I think I'm a little over time, I apologize, to answer some questions.
Like I said, can y'all hear me? Great job, Ife. Look, y'all, my mama is in the audience. She said, you didn't give us enough breaks. I said, I know my coworkers, okay? We got to keep it moving. So we will do some short questions. We'll see how that goes. So let me start with Ray. How is the Department of Labor supposed to modernize with no additional funds?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question just answered itself. But I mean, I think there's also something for, Department of Labor folks to answer. I mean, there's something for, state lawmakers to answer in terms of like what they're able to do with the dollars that they have. I don't know whether it was just a mistake that was made in the upcoming, budget hearings that are going to happen in the Capitol. But, as of last week, they got canceled for this week, so maybe they're going to add them in. But I did not see the Department of Labor listed on the agenda to even talk about their upcoming budget. So I hope that was just a mistake, and that will be, representatives from the Department of Labor to be able to speak to that, as far as how they're using the money, the little money they have, particularly when they generate so much money, so much revenue from administrative assessment fees that, they're just going back to the state. And that's been a long fight that many labor commissioners have fought in terms of, what was the intent of that money, of that revenue when it was created and where it should go. But when there's so much revenue that's being generated every year, I mean, that's certainly something we want to hear from our leaders at the Department of Labor, as well as state lawmakers in terms of like what can be done to use that for what is being phrased as the biggest modernization of our unemployment insurance system, in our state.
Great, thank you so much. Ife, here's a question for you/Leah, but I think you can answer this. Can you say more about what GBPI is doing to try to protect against cuts to SNAP or other similar programs?
Well, we will
Because
be
Medicaid was in there too.
Yeah, we'll be engaging at the federal level as well. But I think the biggest thing is to begin to educate everyone about its impact. We certainly talk about the impact to individuals, to kids, to people with disabilities, to the elderly, because those are the folks who receive SNAP, right? And that's important. But we also have to continue to make the case about why it's important to the economy as well, because some legislators really value that, understanding that impact. And again, it's really what I said. SNAP is incredibly important in those small rural communities and small towns, right? It can be used at farm stands. It could be used at convenience stores. It can be used at grocery stores. It can be used at the big box stores. It's also important to farmers, right? It creates demand for farmers. It supports the food distribution system. SNAP is integral to helping people get access to food and to our food systems, right? And again, $3 billion in 2023 coming from all fed dollars, right, coming into the state and supporting local communities. So we also need to continue to educate policymakers at every level, local, state, and federal levels about the meaning of how SNAP is meaningful.
Thank you so much. So that is going to conclude our presentations and Q&A portion. Thank you to all our analysts for sharing their insights and knowledge. As a reminder, if your question did not get answered, we will answer that via email when we're done. Also, please feel free to come talk to an analyst to ask your question. And I just wanted to remind people, I'm sure Stacy will as well, to join us later today for a virtual panel with partners 9 to 5 Georgia. Shout out to 9 to 5 Georgia, woo woo. Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda and Bard Business, where we'll be talking about our Building Economic Security Together project and how you can get engaged. So you can register for that 2 p.m. webinar, that's 2 p.m. today, at bit.ly/bestinsights. And that information was also in your Know Before You Go email. So thank y'all so much, and I'll turn it back over to Stacy.
Whew, y'all, you tired? Is your brain tired? Did anybody learn anything new today? Oh, I love to see it. Y'all give a huge round of applause to this GBPI team. So just as Erin was alluding to, a couple of quick notes about what you can expect from us after today's event. We are recording today's event, and we'll send you a link to that as soon as it's available. We will also take all the questions that came into Mentimeter and answer them and send them back out to you as well. In addition, each of these analysts writes an agency budget overview. Danny's full budget overview was published this morning, but you can, hopefully you're signed up for our newsletter. If you're not, you should be, but those budget overviews will kind of roll out in the next couple of weeks, so you can get more details about what you heard today in those budget overviews. And as Erin mentioned, we've got some great work going online this afternoon, the QR codes in your program. Despite what you might think by this seal on this podium, we are not a state government agency. We are a nonprofit, just like a lot of the people who work in this space, who are here today, and we count on your dollars to do our work. And you can imagine, I know y'all just sat through 3 hours of listening to the budget. This is actually a really wonky, really niche kind of work that only a certain handful of folks like y'all are interested in. And so we've got some of our great funders in the room today and some of our great donors, and we're so appreciative. And if you haven't joined their ranks yet, there's a pledge card in your program if you'd like to hand it to one of our staff and we can be in touch, or you're welcome to use a QR code or go online and make a donation there to help continue this great work. So I know you're counting on us, but y'all, we are also counting on you. If you've ever gotten an email from me, you know that I believe that we are in this together. So we will see you at the Capitol. Thanks for being here today.